Since you mentioned your experience as a weapons inspector, I want to ask you to draw on that to talk about the role of the U.S. dismantling of arms control treaties in this crisis. One of those treaties you helped implement as an inspector, helping to basically put in force the INF Treaty, a Cold War pact reached between Reagan and Gorbachev that eliminated an entire class of missiles. And you were on the ground enforcing that treaty, and Trump killed it. The U.S. ignored Russian demands to extend it, preserve parts of it, as did NATO. And moving beyond Ukraine a little bit, I'm wondering what role has the dismantling of arms control treaties like the INF Treaty under Trump, like the ABM Treaty under Bush, like the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty under Bush as well, I think, Open Skies Treaty under Trump. What role that has played in Russia's thinking in terms of why it felt the need to invade Ukraine?
Well, we'll start with the predicate of the underlying predicate of the invasion was to create a condition that would allow for the redefining of a European security framework between Russia and the West. Now, why would Russia need a European security framework redefined? Because the existing one is viewed by Russia as representing an existential threat. An existing one that has an expansive NATO coming right up to its borders, a NATO that believes that it can operate outside of the framework of the United Nations Charter, Article 51. The only allowed use of force is in self-defense or authorized by Chapter 7. Well, NATO says we're not a state. We're not a member of the United Nations. Therefore, we're not bound by Article 51. That's actually the argument they used to justify their intervention in Serbia in 1999. So you have this aggressive, offensive-minded organization that comes in, and there's nothing to hold it back. And what I mean by that is, look what they did in Poland and Romania. They installed two what's called Aegis offshore sites, Mark 41 Aegis systems, giant phased array radars that fire SM-3 missiles and that have been adapted for a anti-ballistic missile role. The problem with the Mark 41 system is it's a canisterized system on a ship that, in addition to the SM-3, also has Tomahawk missiles. And a Tomahawk missile put on the ground becomes an intermediate range missile, which is banned by the Intermediate Range Treaty, the INF Treaty. So the INF Treaty became inconvenient to the United States because we wanted to be able to do that. But even when we weren't thinking about that, we were also talking about modifying the SM-3 missile to become something called the SM-6 Typhoon, which is basically a SM-3 that's now modified for a surface-to-surface capability. Again, operating from the same site in Poland and in Romania. Russia just doesn't like this because you turn those sites into surface-to-surface missile launch sites. You're talking about being able to fire a missile that, if it's a Typhoon, can reach St. Petersburg, Moscow, Soviet or Russian leadership sites within 5 to 7 minutes. Why is that important? Let's back up now in time. When nuclear weapons came into being, the United States and the Soviet Union got into an arms race. It was basically, the U.S. looked at Russian missiles, said, well, we need to get our missile, the Minuteman, solid rocket launch. Boom. The Russians went, oh my God, the Minuteman can now take out this. So we have to build our own missiles with multiple warheads that can take out the Minuteman sites. And it just got out of control where we were building missile system after missile system. So the minds that be said, okay, why don't we agree on a concept called mutually assured destruction? That is, we both agree that we can kill each other. Therefore, it makes no sense for either one of us to attack. Then what we do is we put in place a ballistic missile, anti-ballistic missile treaty. Why? Because if we agree that we can kill each other, why build defenses? The whole purpose of mutually assured destruction is to agree that we can kill each other. And if you build a defense, all that creates is the need to destroy that defense with more weapons. So the ABM Treaty is one of the cornerstones of nuclear security. It allows this situation to exist where neither side will use nuclear weapons because it means the automatic termination of life for everybody involved. And that worked until we got involved with what's called intermediate nuclear forces, these medium-range missiles. What happened with those is that the The Russians were feeling a little out of place. They needed a new weapon system to replace the 1950s era, the ones that were sent to Cuba, by the way, the SS-4, SS-5. So the Russians built something called the SS-20, which is a mobile missile with 3 warheads that basically allowed Russia to take out all of Europe in a heartbeat. And the Europeans went, this is really, really bad. And so they asked the United States to come up with a counter. So the US came up with the cruise missile, ground-launched cruise missile, and the Pershing II missile. Pershing II is a solid rocket, high-speed missile that if it was fired from a site in West Germany, would be able to take Moscow out in 5 minutes. And the Russians went, we can't tolerate that. That's a very dangerous situation. This is unstable. But so both sides were getting ready to deploy this. Something happened in 1983 during a military exercise called Reforger. They had an internal exercise called Able Archer. Able Archer was a command and control exercise where we were simulating nuclear launch. Now, the Russians prior to this, and we didn't know this, had believed that one of the things the United States would do to launch a secret attack against Russia would be to use a Reforger exercise to get all the troops over there and then launch the surprise nuclear attack. So the Russians are already looking at this large Reforger exercise, and they're listening in, and they go, holy crap, they just issued launch instructions. They're going to war again. This is the preemptive strike. So the Russians immediately put the SS-20 missile units on higher alert, got them ready to launch a nuclear, we're ready to go to war, nuclear war. When the CIA briefed Ronald Reagan on this a year later, allegedly he went pale. He got physically sick. And he said, my God, they couldn't actually believe that we were going to launch a first strike. And the CIA said, yeah, they believed it. And he said, then we have to make sure this never happens again. The end result of this, the INF Treaty, a treaty which banned this class of missile that was seen by both sides as being inherently destabilizing. Prior to the INF Treaty, I grew up in Germany. I went to high school in Germany. I have to tell you, we lived next door to a nuclear weapons depot. It was going to be struck if there was ever a war by a nuclear weapon. And there multiple times a year, my dad went into the bunker because there was a crisis. Now, if he's going in the bunker, that means he's supposed to live through a nuclear weapons attack, which might occur at any moment. So every day I'm going to high school wondering if the world is going to end today, literally. And that happened all the time. That's what Europe lived under, the ever-present threat of immediate annihilation from nuclear weapons. We got rid of those weapons. Wonderful thing. We got rid of them and we brought stability to Europe because no longer is Europe functioning under this hair trigger alert system. They don't have to worry about nuclear weapons raining in on things. What did Donald Trump do? Well, first thing that happened is that George W. Bush got out of the ABM treaty because he no longer respected Russia's nuclear deterrence. And he said that the concept of mutually assured destruction is stupid. We want to live. We want to create missile defense shield that allows us to survive. We're not going to live in an environment where we say, oh, we're going to die. So we did that. We did that because the Russians were weak, because the Russians had nothing. And we kept lying to the Russians saying this isn't about you, but it was all about the Russians. We build that, and then we get out of the INF treaty, the one that the Russians were saying that, we accused Russia of cheating. They weren't. Russia said, no, you guys are cheating. This Mark 41 Aegis system is capable of launching cruise missiles, and you guys are deploying it on the ground, which makes it a violation of the INF treaty. Well, the way we solve that is to get out of the INF treaty. How do we know the Russians were right? Less than a month after we got out of the INF treaty, we tested a Tomahawk missile fired from a Mark 41 system. But we always had the intention of doing this. But in doing this, we've now opened the door to a Russian response. What have the Russians done? They have built an entire category, new categories of nuclear weapons that are designed to defeat any ballistic missile defense system the United States has. And they're telling the U.S. that if you put intermediate nuclear forces on the ground in Europe, we'll have to deploy our own missile systems that we're not deploying right now. The bottom line is we're returning to that scenario in the 1980s where every European child wakes up wondering if this is the day that I get the 200,000 degree suntan. That's the genius of the American system. That's the moronic reality of the idiots in Washington, D.C. who are running this policy. Putin didn't want this. How do we know? Because he said over and over again, I didn't want this. In 2018, he gave a speech where he announced these weapons. He said, I've been telling you the whole time, don't do this. This is bad. We don't want to do this, but we have to. We have no choice. He said, you didn't listen to me then. Are you listening now? And we are listening now because it's a reality. But what are we doing about it? At a time when we should be trying to restart the INF Treaty, instead we're getting ready to deploy something called the Dark Eagle, which is a hypersonic missile system that's going to go into Germany this year. We reactivated the same artillery brigade that operated the Pershing II missile during the INF Treaty that was done away with. We brought it back to life. It's in Germany right now, preparing to receive Dark Eagle. And when we receive the Dark Eagle, the Russians are going to unveil whatever they have. And now, under normal circumstances, you say, well, that's pretty bad. But normally you'd say, well, there's little chance of a misunderstanding, right? Well, what do we got going on in Ukraine right now? One giant scenario for misunderstanding.
Yep.
And so we are creating the conditions for the demise of the world. That's why arms control is so important.